Yeah, I'm going to spend most of the time talking about medications that have already been approved for ALS by the FDA. A little bit on non-invasive ventilation, just to kind of highlight its benefits relative to the medications that are out there. And then if time's permitting, I have a little bit on medications that are under investigation that might hold some promise, but just one slide, and if we have time. All right. So disclosures, I don't have any financial disclosures. I was part of the very large team that investigated tofersen. This is when I was still an employee at Washington University in St. Louis. So an outline of what I'm going to talk about. So we have riluzole, we have radicava, we have Relyvrio, these medicines that start with R. And then a little bit about non-invasive ventilation, and then a little bit about tofersen as well. So this slide is kind of complicated. It comes from this guy named Paul Taylor, who's a big time ALS researcher. And the reason why I wanted to show it is this is meant to schematize all the different things on a cellular level that are thought to contribute to ALS. And so, you know, I think what we're going to see in the future is there's probably never going to be one medicine that's going to be the main thing that changes how we treat ALS, because we have to address a lot of these different problems. And so that's the reason why I showed this slide, and also to just kind of highlight which drugs are kind of targeting which part. Can you guys see my cursor here as it's moving around? Yeah. So the first medication, riluzole, that I'm going to talk about, you know, it's thought to target this excitotoxicity, this interaction between nerve cells that help control our muscles and these things called astrocytes that help support the nerve cells. And so riluzole, it's thought to reduce this excess excitability, so too much sort of electrical exchange between motor neurons. And it's a little bit murky as to exactly how it helps, but by reducing this excitability, that's how it's thought to be therapeutic for the setting of ALS. So riluzole has been around since a trial in 1994. Trials back then for ALS are pretty different than they are now. So this trial, it included people ages 20 to 75. There's this thing called the Ellis-Scoriel criteria for ALS that I don't really want to get into, but what they did is they took people who had probable or definite ALS. Definite kind of means it's affecting 3 parts of your body. Probable means at least 2 parts of your body. They included anybody who had had the disease for 5 years or less, and then anybody with a breathing test, the FVC, the sort of how big was a single breath is of at least 60%, or those who did not have a tracheostomy. It was at 7 different centers, and they kind of split people into those with limb onset versus bulbar onset, and the dose they give, which is the dose we give now, 50 milligrams twice a day. So, and what they looked at, and this is different than newer studies, clinical trials in ALS, is they looked at death and they looked at tracheostomy. So those were kind of the main endpoints. And then to a degree, they looked at functional status, this thing called the Norris score, which I'm not going to talk too much about. They also looked at muscle strength. They looked at sort of this subjective impression of change scale, and then looked at breathing function. They evaluated patients every couple of months. And so, and it was this study that showed that riluzole probably works, and what led to its approval. So at 12 months, about half of people, 58% in the placebo group, were still alive or tracheostomy free, versus 74% in the riluzole group. And then at 24 months, which was the conclusion of the trial, so a 2-year-long trial, which again, you don't really see that anymore, which is too bad. And we can talk about that later. But at 24 months, 37% in the placebo group alive versus 49% in the riluzole group. And so it changed survival on average from 449 to 532 or 83 days. And so sometimes when doctors talk about riluzole leading to a 3-month prolongation of life, it's from this trial. Subsequent data kind of suggests it's more like 3 to 6 months. But this is the initial study showing, you know, about a 3-month survival benefit. What was really interesting, and this data hasn't really been repeated well, was the difference in the bulbar onset ALS versus limb onset, in that it seemed to have a much more dramatic effect in those with bulbar onset ALS. And you can see this scale here. This is called the Kaplan-Meier curve. So this is the number of patients who are alive and tracheostomy free here. And then it's time in months on the bottom. And you can see that those who got Riluzole versus those that got placebo, there's a significant survival benefit in people with bulbar onset ALS. And then to the right with limb onset, you can see that difference is less impressive. And so the survival gain on average, and again, this is just the one trial in 1994, was 237 days for bulbar onset ALS versus just 8 for limb. And so for a long time, people just gave Riluzole for bulbar onset ALS, but subsequent studies have shown that that's probably not a good idea, because there is a significant survival benefit with both. Again, probably about 3 to 6 months for both bulbar and limb onset ALS. And then some other things that they looked at, they had these like scales, kind of like the ALS-FRS of limb function and bulbar function. Those weren't significantly different, but when the investigators actually measured strength, people who were on Riluzole over this time period had a much more preserved strength relative to those that got the placebo. In terms of side effects, the biggest thing that people noticed, I'm going to highlight 2 different things. One is this thing that they just called asthenia. This is just a general term for kind of weakness, fatigue, feeling just out of energy. And there were more of those that had this reaction in the Riluzole group relative to those in the placebo group, 20 versus 11. And then in terms of liver function tests, and this is why we have to do that blood work when we prescribe Riluzole, there were 13 in the placebo group that had an increase in these liver function tests, indicative of maybe some degree of mild liver injury versus 6 in the placebo group. So those, when we talk about side effects, those are the big ones. Nausea, we don't really see a difference in the 1994 trial, but subsequent sort of post-marketing data has shown that nausea is a risk with taking Riluzole. So the takeaway is Riluzole is a safe drug. It does seem to slow the progression of the disease. We have a lot of data on this now because it's been around since 1994. So it does seem to slow the progression of the disease and prolong survival. And there's been a thing called a Cochrane review, which is kind of a review of all of the good literature that's out there. And really what that showed is that there seems to be a 3 to 6 month survival benefit across both limb and bulbar onset groups. And there are other studies that I didn't highlight here that if you start the medicine, and this is the case with all of the FDA approved medications for ALS, but if you start it late in the disease course, it probably doesn't do nearly as much as compared to when you start it early in the disease course. So usually when I advise patients, if they want to take one of these medications, it makes sense to start it earlier than later. Going back to this ALS pathogenesis slide. So again, we kind of address this part with the interaction between the astrocyte and the motor neuron here. The next one I'm going to talk about, edaravone or radicava, is trying to get at these reactive oxygen species, which is these sort of metabolic byproducts that result from a bunch of different cellular processes. But the big one with ALS is thought to be this interaction between a white blood cell type that circulates in the central nervous system called microglia and the motor neuron. And that interaction can lead to the production of reactive oxygen species, which are thought to contribute to motor neuron disease. So radicava, what does it do? So it's thought to soak up these reactive oxygen species, kind of just lower the burden of the reactive oxygen species in the brain. There might be other mechanisms, but those have yet to be discovered. So it's a little murky how it works. So initially, this was tried in ALS in 2014, a trial in Japan. Again, ages 20 to 75, just like Riluzole. Probable or definite ALS, like Riluzole. But instead of actually, sorry, I don't want to jump ahead. They also took people with an ALS-FRS, a change of either 1 to 4 over 12 weeks. So what they're trying to avoid is people who are very slowly progressive and people who are really fast progressing. I'm going to skip the stuff about the Japanese severity scale. And then breathing test, they wanted a vital capacity of at least 70%, kind of like Riluzole. And then the endpoint here, very different than Riluzole, because it's a much shorter trial. It was only 24 weeks as opposed to 24 months. they looked at the change in the ALS FRS, which is like most of you probably know what this is, but it's like a survey going through the different things, how well is swallowing going, how well is walking going, breathing going, that sort of thing. And then they looked at a bunch of other endpoints, breathing tests, grip strength, quality of life measures. And again, their study was too short for a survival analysis. So this is very different than what was done for Riluzole. And I'm not going to bore you guys with all the numbers here, but essentially this 2014 trial didn't show a difference between the groups. When you looked more closely at the data, maybe there was a hint of a difference. So this is a change in ALS FRS score over time. So the bigger the bar going downward, the worse it is. And those that got edaravone or radicava maybe did a little bit better in terms of that ALS FRS score, but it wasn't statistically significant. In terms of side effects, the big stuff worth highlighting is a fair number of those with what they call a gait disturbance, or just feeling more unsteady on your feet, which is obviously not a good thing in the setting of ALS. Not a huge difference between placebo and the radicava group, 20% versus 15%. And then let's see some other things. Contusion's not really relevant anymore because this medicine used to be given through a port and now it's given orally. But those are the two main things to highlight. So the discussion, is a short study, 24 weeks versus 24 months. Results may be promising. Safety profile looks pretty good. And then what they did is they looked further into the data and found that patients with really early disease, maybe they would have a greater benefit. So they redid the trial again in Japan in 2017, and they kind of changed their criteria a bit. So with the ALS FRS, they made sure there was at least a score of 2 in each category. And I think what they were trying to avoid are people that were, had significantly progressed disease in any particular domain. And then they needed less than 2 years since symptom onset. So again, this is very different than Riluzole, which allowed anybody with 5 or fewer years of symptoms. And so just to kind of hit the high points here, in this second trial, they did see a difference in the change in ALS FRS. It went down over this 24-week period, on average of 7.5 points in the placebo group versus 5 points in the edaravone group. Again, this trial wasn't long enough to look at things like survival. They did see that in the edaravone group, 1 person lost any usable speech, 1 person required a tracheostomy. In the placebo group, there was maybe more, but again, this study's not designed to look at this. 3 with loss of speech, 1 who lost the ability to walk on their own, and 1 who required the placement of a feeding tube. So here's the data again summarized, and the biggest difference was in the change in ALS FRS over this 12-week period. So from that standpoint, it was promising. And then there was a hint, it wasn't statistically significant, but there was a suggestion that maybe it helps the breathing as well. And then there's this modified Norris scale score, which is kind of how well your limbs and ability to swallow and speak are working sort of in relation to every day-to-day life, and there was a significant difference there. No difference in grip strength or pinch strength at the end of this. Actually, before I get into that, talking about adverse events, pretty impressive in terms of, sorry, I skipped ahead. In terms of adverse events, not really any major differences between the two groups. Again, so gait instability, which has shown to be an issue over time in the post-marketing period, not really an issue in this 2017 study, which is a bit surprising. Some of this, I'm going to kind of inject my opinion in here, and I'll try to let you know when I'm injecting my opinion. So edaravone is safe. Trials show that. My opinion is that it's safe. Its efficacy has been called into question. One thing I didn't show here is there was a group in Europe that tried to repeat this study. It was a retrospective analysis as opposed to being a placebo-controlled trial, but they found no difference in those that got edaravone versus those that did not. And sorry, I'm using edaravone and radicava interchangeably. And so in Europe, this drug is not approved because the consensus among the regulatory bodies in Europe is that this drug is not effective. The biggest side effect in the post-marketing period has been unsteadiness, and that's been about 13% of people who take this drug. Again, the buy-in to take this drug used to be pretty major. It used to require a port IV infusions. Now it's an oral medication. The reason why that was approved is it was found that the oral formulation would lead to the same blood levels as the IV infusion, and so the oral has essentially replaced the IV infusion. More studies are being done to try to better understand how effective, or if effective, or if it's effective, and how it might be effective, and how it might be working. And so, again, Daravone's a little bit of a mixed bag. I have a harder time advising patients on doing it versus not doing it, but I think it is important to note that it is safe. Going back to this really complicated thing with ALS pathogenesis, so we've talked about riluzole, which kind of gets at this interaction here with the hyperexcitability, and then edaravone or radicava with this reactive oxygen species from the activation of these white blood cells that are in the central nervous system. Now I'm going to talk about Relyvrio, which is it's very murky as to what Relyvrio does, but one of the things it's supposed to do is kind of improve these disturbances in protein quality control, or rather try to get rid of some of the problematic misfolded proteins that can kind of aggregate in the setting of ALS, and that's thought to contribute to the disease. So Relyvrio, a phase 2 trial done in 2020. So it's a combination of drugs that, interestingly, both began their lives as essentially supplements, whose mechanism is really it's unknown. The inclusion criteria a little bit different. This required definite ALS, so only those that had clear ALS disease patterns in sort of 3 parts of the body. That could be, face, arms, trunk, legs. This one was even more restrictive in terms of time from onset to when the trial started. So that had to be less than a year and a half. And then the vital capacity, they measured it a little bit differently with something called the slow vital capacity, but you can think of that like the functional vital capacity. It had to be at least 60%. So this group, I would argue, is probably the most restrictive of any that I've talked about. The monitoring here was every 3 weeks for a total of 24 weeks, like radicava. It looked at the ALS-FRS. It looked at strength. It looked at this thing called neurofilament heavy chain, which has kind of fallen out of favor now. And then it looked at breathing measures. And then it looked at secondary outcomes, like how many people would get a tracheostomy, how many were required hospitalization for any reason, and then how many passed during the course of the trial. This is a really busy slide, but I want to highlight a couple of things. So the biggest difference that they found in this trial is that there was less of a drop in the ALS-FRS in those that received Relyvrio, at that time just called sodium phenylbutyrate taurursodiol, or TUDCA. Anyway, the people who got Relyvrio did better in terms of the drop in ALS-FRS compared to those that got placebo. And then some of the other measures that are worth noting, there was no clear difference in strength testing. There was no clear difference in this thing called neurofilament heavy chain, although again that testing has largely fallen out of favor. And then there was maybe kind of a hint of a difference in terms of the breathing test. Those that got Relyvrio did a little bit better. And then they did a subsequent analysis looking at survival. So what they did is in this initial period here, this is the trial, so it's just a short period of time. No difference in survival in the trial. And then what they did after that is something called an open label extension, where everybody in the trial would get the drug. And what they found is that if you go out now several months, those that got Relyvrio in that early time period lived about 6.5 months longer than those that did not. And so their argument was that, hey, this seems to yield a survival benefit, even from taking the drug versus not in this relatively brief 24-week period. And I think it's ultimately this data that led to its FDA approval. So a little bit more discussion on Relyvrio. It's really unclear how it works in terms of a kind of molecular, cellular mechanism of action. I think it's pretty darn safe. I didn't show the safety data because the way it's presented in the publication is really unclear. But GI side effects, so gastrointestinal side effects with diarrhea, abdominal pain, nausea. Those are the big ones. It's hard to know how much of the nausea is because this medicine apparently tastes just ghastly. So people don't like it. And based on the descriptions I've heard, I don't blame them. But it's probably an effective medication. The thing is there's still an ongoing, well, it's not ongoing. The trial's been completed, but they're still going through the data. The phase 3 trial results are pending. And so the FDA has approved this kind of temporarily pending the results of the phase 3 trial. So there's a chance this could come off the market if the phase 3 trial is not promising. But for now, this medication is available. My sense is that it probably works, and that it probably works in a manner that's similar in magnitude to Riluzole. That's my opinion. All right. How am I doing time-wise before I sidetrack things a little bit? Doing pretty well, 124. I want to talk briefly about non-invasive ventilation because I think it's really, really important that patients go on this if they need it. And so I'm going to touch on just a couple of trials that were done again, with people with ALS that had respiratory involvement. So there's a trial done back in 1999 where they offered BiPAP to people with ALS who had a vital capacity of less than 50%, or a significant drop over a 3-month period. And so they split them between 3 groups. Those that accepted the BiPAP and could use it at least 4 hours a day, those that accepted BiPAP but couldn't use it 4 hours a day, and those that didn't want the BiPAP. So it's not perfect. It's obviously not placebo controlled, but you can't really do that with something like BiPAP. And there was a significant slowing of the decline in the functional vital capacity in those that had BiPAP at least 4 hours a day, especially compared to those that didn't elect to start BiPAP. And they did a survival analysis as well. And again, this group 1 is those who use BiPAP at least 4 hours a day, compared to group 3 here that didn't use it at all. A pretty significant survival benefit of several months. And so I like to bring this up to patients because when breathing gets affected, as it does in most people with ALS, it's good to start BiPAP if you can tolerate it, because it really seems to help slow the progression of the disease. There's another study done in 2006 by a different group, and again, they looked at those that got BiPAP or some other kind of non-invasive ventilation versus those that didn't. Again, this is not a placebo-controlled study, but what they found is a significant improvement in survival, benefit of 6 or 7 months in those that elected to be on BiPAP. And a caveat of this, they took people who had so-called good bulbar function, as in those that had enough strength in terms of swallowing, speech, that sort of thing. So this is a little bit of a caveat with interpreting these results. But anyway, I wanted to touch on this a little bit because with the medications we're talking about, 3, 6, and depending on how you do the analyses with Relyvrio, maybe a 10-month survival benefit. But with something as relatively straightforward as BiPAP or non-invasive ventilation, there seems to be a significant survival benefit. So this is kind of a plug for, we should be monitoring everyone in terms of breathing function, and when that time comes, when it gets below a certain level, usually it's the functional vital capacity less than 50 or 60%. That's when this should be started in essentially everyone with ALS. Okay. So non-invasive ventilation or BiPAP, it seems to prolong survival, slow the disease progression. And again, just to plug, make sure you're getting regular pulmonary function tests if you are not already on BiPAP or some other kind of non-invasive ventilation. Okay, I'm going to talk briefly about tofersen. And I guess I should highlight briefly, because this is a treatment for only 2% of ALS. So this is for an inherited form of ALS we call SOD1 or SOD1 ALS. Again, it represents 2% of all ALS. So we're talking 400 or 500 people in the entire United States. So this drug is, the reason I want to bring it up is because I think it's giving a lot of people in the ALS field hope that we may have new ways to treat ALS in a gene targeted manner, and the hope extends not just to the inherited forms of ALS but all forms of ALS. So it reduces the production of this mutant protein that results from these SOD1 gene mutations. It's very different than the other medications. It's not oral, it's intrathecal. I have just a picture of a lumbar puncture down here that I stole from Mayo Clinic. And essentially you do a lumbar puncture, but you infuse the drug through the needle. And it's I guess before I get into it, I am giving this medication now so far to just one person at UW, but it's kind of a big deal compared to the other medications that I talked about. You have to come in every month to have this done. But again, I'm going to show you why I think it has a lot of promise. So there's a phase 2 trial that was done recently, and in the interest of full disclosure, I was one of the investigators on this trial. But again, I don't have any financial stake with Biogen. So we had 108 people in the trial, 72 got the drug, 36 got placebo, and then essentially it was anybody with SOD1 ALS who's an adult and has a vital capacity of 50% or more. And again, it was only 28 weeks for the trial, not like these long trials that we used to have. And then 24 weeks for an open label extension where, again, everybody then would get the drug, all 108 people. So all the people who got the placebo would be moved to the treatment group and would be unblinded, as in everybody would know that they're getting the drug. And so we know this drug reduces the mutant protein. That's the red trace here versus the blue trace. And then the blue trace, here's the open label extension. So when the people who went from placebo to drug, that dropped the mutant protein levels. Then here's a measure called the neurofilament light chain in plasma, which has kind of become the standard of the standard biomarker for ALS, which is maybe a marker of disease activity. People who got the drug, it greatly reduced this level of neurofilament light chain versus those that got the placebo. And then in the open label extension, you can see when people who went from placebo to drug, this neurofilament light chain thing went way down. Interpreting the clinical results of the study are a little bit tricky because in this 28-week period, in terms of ALS FRS, there really wasn't a significant difference between the groups, kind of a trend toward a difference. But in the open label extension, that's when the two groups seem to separate, as in those that got tofersen seemed to do better than those that initially got the placebo and then subsequently switched to getting the drug. And then it was kind of the same thing in terms of the breathing test. Those that got tofersen all along seemed to do better. Same thing with strength measurements. And then now there's been at least some survival analysis, and again, showing that those that got the drug initially seem to be doing better than those that initially got the placebo. And so it's this data that led to its FDA approval. So this is a safe medication. It might be effective. There's more studies that, in my opinion, that need to be done. And I guess what's exciting about this is now there's a ton of money from drug companies trying to develop similar therapies for both inherited as well as non-inherited versions of ALS. And so I think this is kind of exciting, and I think the next few years I'm hopeful will yield some significant new therapies. So let's see, before I get into investigational therapies, I think it's probably a good time to pause and answer questions that people have. I just went through a lot in 30 minutes. Feel free to interrupt me at any point here, but just one slide on investigational therapies that I'm trying to highlight the ones that at least in the field, there's kind of the most buzz around. The first one is Neurone, which is a trial where the patient had bone marrow that was aspirated. So they got a bone marrow biopsy, and then the bone marrow was it was kind of manipulated molecularly to generate stem cells, and then those stem cells were infused into the lower back, kind of like the tofersen drug. Medication was found to be safe, which is pretty remarkable considering how much of a major intervention that is. And it improves things like neurofilament. It didn't have a clinical benefit. And so when this company that owns the rights to Neurone went to the FDA said no. But I know they're still working on it. There might be a new trial that comes out with a slightly different formulation of this. But this is something that has a lot of buzz, but unfortunately at this point hasn't shown anything that would be consistent with a clinical benefit. Trehalose is the second one I want to highlight. There's a phase 3 trial that's pending. This is an IV infusion of a medication. It was part of this thing called the platform trial, which is It's like this giant multi-part clinical trial that's based in Boston at Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the Harvard hospitals. But this is a medication that's it's gotten a lot of attention from the federal government, positive attention, and one that may have some efficacy. So we'll probably hear more about that medication in the next year or so. There's another one that's it's this it's kind of strange. It's nanoparticles made of gold. Nobody knows how they work. It's a little bit unclear to me how they made it to clinical trials, but there was a recent study showing that these, and this is the CNM-AU8 thing, showing that it improved that neurofilament thing, so suggesting that it's reducing ALS disease activity. Unclear if it's safe, and so there's a phase 3 trial that's being planned for this drug. And then the last one here is called masitinib. This is something that's predominantly been tried in Europe to this point. That when taken with riluzole, there's some signal for efficacy that it may be helpful. It's an anti-inflammatory drug thought to reduce the activity of some of those white blood cells that are in the central nervous system. And so the phase 3 is thought to start sometime in the coming months. It's possible that UW will be one of those sites. So anyway, I just want to touch on those, showing there are a ton of drugs in trial right now. I just wanted to highlight some that have some promise. All right, that's all I have.